Bonjour à vous toutes, à vous tous.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to greet you all today during this session of the Atlantic Dialogues on the theme of post-COVID and post-COVID recovery, its uncertainties, its potential, its opportunities. And around this table, we have three distinguished guests, regulars at the Atlantic Dialogues. It's the first time, however, that we are meeting around this table. We have Madame Candide La Maison de Guerre, who is a consultant in gender and development and who is extremely active in female entrepreneurship in Togo and in ECOWAS and generally, and she accompanies young enterprises in their development, particularly women's empowerment in business, and she's also a director of a French-speaking female entrepreneurship network. And her perspective is extremely interesting and insightful because COVID, as you all know, has been very much unequal. I mean, women have been a lot more impacted in their activities than men in this crisis, and also how we can support these new initiatives in Africa, in particular women's entrepreneurship, youth entrepreneurship, and the debate remains open for all issues pertaining to this recovery policy after this harsh crisis that we have experienced. We will also be greeting in this panel Mr. Pedro da Mota Veiga, who is Brazilian. He's Latin American, and naturally, he's the director of a Center for Studies on Integration and Development, and it's a think tank, an independent think tank, in fact, which is based in Rio de Janeiro, which is focused on trade, investment in Latin America, on global issues as well. And I also believe that this theme of economic recovery, of global recovery, its dynamics, and it's has been felt very differently based on the regions. And so, as such, Mr. Pedro da Mota Veiga's insight will be very, very interesting, and it will also be interesting to discuss the different recovery mechanisms. Our third distinguished guest is Mr. Jean-Louis Sarbib, who is a connoisseur of Morocco. He was often present in the support of a certain number of programs and development policies in Morocco and worldwide, and he is currently responsible for an international think tank who's also a member of the Emerging Markets. He's also a fellow of the Emerging Markets Forum and chair of the Asset Advisory Panel for the G20 Compact for Africa. This aspect relating to countries of the South, and particularly the Atlantic, and what interests us regarding this perspective, the global economy in this panel will most certainly be very insightful. And this will truly allow us to see in which direction we're heading and whether we are truly out, whether this pandemic is really behind us or not. And one of the questions that I'd invite you to reflect on, and I will ask you three questions. The first is whether this pandemic can truly be considered as a turning point in the design of a development model and the new perspective of the global economy, and also the main issue that was addressed in the literature and in public debates is whether globalization is related to this pandemic to a certain extent. And issues pertaining to international trade and even the trade routes have always coincided with the appearance or the onset of viruses, and globalization and its evolution today further strengthens this tie between global trade and the pandemic. It is true that this issue of this pandemic crisis also occurs in an environment in where issues relating to the environment, deforestation, intensive agriculture, and the disruptions of the geological and geophysical cycles are obviously very striking. So should we consider that globalization is responsible for this pandemic? Should we also be in a logic of deglobalization, or is that concept utopic, or maybe should we rethink globalization, which would be a little more appropriate to think of the world of tomorrow? It seems that there is a belief that is being imposed that we share of sorts, which consists in saying that the risks related to the pandemic between extremely frequent risks, and these pandemic risks have an impact on the regional, the national, regional, international scenes. And so, as such, we need to reflect on another form of a global organization which truly and collectively addresses these crises in the long term. So what do you think about this perspective, which is shared, or maybe which is also controversial? I mean, it would be interesting to hear your point of view on this pandemic being a turning point with respect to our development models. Madame Candide, Babizon Leguet, may I give you the floor first?
Yeah, merci beaucoup.
And if you could maybe take a jab at this question. Thank you very much, Mr. Larrabee, for giving me the floor. You are absolutely right. The COVID-19 crisis is a brutal crisis, a global crisis, and that is really meddling has come to meddle in the public sphere, in the economic sphere, the professional sphere, and in our private lives. And it is truly coming to establish itself. And given that today we're all faced with this issue, and globally this is an unprecedented crisis, we have had to take a step back. I remember when during the lockdown. I mean, for example, if we take a look at New York, which is a vibrant city that was a sort of ghost town from one day to the next, and this just goes to say that this is something that there's never been seen before, and this has led us to step out of our comfort zones and to head towards new development models. And for example, when we see the public sphere and how our individual freedom has also been impacted. I mean, in fact, we no longer have any sort of freedom. We have to wear masks. We need to observe social distancing, and this has created new circumstances that are also very that are very comfortable, and that have led us to think our behavior, or whether it concerns the corporate world or governmentally, or even the households. I mean, just even handling the household that has needed to be completely reshaped, because the virus has established itself, and I mean, we don't know how long this virus is here to stay. So obviously there are caution is it's important to be cautious, and so this there has been a significant impact, and this impact is continuing. I mean, there has been major recession. There have been many companies that have gone under. There's unemployment. I mean, even in the labor codes, this new form of people. I mean, these new forms of these people being fired due to COVID, and all of these new types of phenomena have not even been integrated in labor laws. And so, in this sense, it's important to reflect on compromises or collective solution that can make sure that there is a middle ground for that there is an actual feasible middle ground. I mean, even in terms of transportation, this is something that we'll probably discuss later on. You know, in the end, in all aspects, whether it is in transportation, road transport, or air transport, or even mask wearing, and also in terms of resilience as well, where I must say that faced with this pandemic, we have had to find ways to survive, and whether it is for corporations or also for individuals. So these are all challenges that need to be overcome and that we are faced with today. Thank you, Madam. It's true that these are issues that we will be discussing later on the part, later on, particularly relating to employment, and maybe to start out this discussion on the economic model today. I mean, we are this is definitely very topical of reviewing the models, reforming development models, alternative development models, or this model concept has become a real trend in our reflection without knowing very more specifically what we mean by this particular model, whether it is at the national level, the regional level, at the global level, or this is concern globalization. Now, I'd like to turn to Mr. Pedro da Motavica. What is your perspective beyond the Atlantic, where this crisis has also been harshly experienced by many countries, including Brazil? Thank you. I would like to thank the Policy Center for the New South and Mr. Larabi Tahidi, our moderator, for hosting us for this 10th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues. And this will indeed be a very important and interesting theme to address. This change in our lifestyles, in our day-to-day life, which has been completely disrupted due to the onset of this virus. Well, obviously, this virus and the pandemic has lasted much longer than we could have anticipated. If somebody would have told me a year ago that had asked me whether the Atlantic Dialogues were taking place in Marrakesh, I would have said, of course. But here we are again on Zoom, and this is because the pandemic has lasted much longer than we could have anticipated. In any case, what I would do, or what I propose to do, is to reflect on the post-pandemic, as Mr. Larabi said, whether the pandemic is not only a virus vector, but or even by thinking more of the long term, whether it's a vector for change. It is a historical turning point, as this has been suggested in the premise or in the paper that we received for this discussion. So I must say that I'm quite skeptical about this perspective. I tend to prefer seeing things maybe rather stronger continuity lines in the history of society, in the histories of societies, and in growth models. And on the other hand, I do think that in certain countries we do see a sort of reconceptualization of growth models. But this reconceptualization of growth models, which is also driven by other factors, and in a sense, factors that were underlying pre-pandemic. And what's concerning, or this is from my perspective, as far as these phenomena go, is that the discussion of these growth models, or the introduction of public policies that are geared to growth models, are perceived in developed countries and in China. For example, in Europe, well, we see the Green Deal project, which is very robust. I mean, it's not an environmental policy per se. It is a meta policy. It is a policy which, in a way, will be present in all of the European Union's policies. the trade policy will also be at the service of the European Green Deal. I mean, that's perfectly clear. And as such, I see here something that's more along the lines of the reconceptualization of climate change and of combating climate change. In the United States, I'm also observing a new trend. I mean, not necessarily along the same lines, not with the same motivation, but I see that in the infrastructure packages or in the recomposition of value chains that have all been introduced by the Biden government. Well, here again, I'm definitely not advocating or I'm not condoning or criticizing here, but I'm simply observing this long-term growth models. And in China, in this new proposal of prosperity, of this new premise of prosperity for all, which is introduced by the Chinese Communist Party, we also see a strategic turning point. This is all driven by the pandemic, and the pandemic, in fact, comes to strengthen certain trends. And Madame Leguidi spoke about resilience, and I'm namely thinking about my area of specialty in the value change. This is all present. This all is strengthened by the pandemic. But in fact, the drivers of this reconceptualization were underlying before the pandemic, and in fact are continuing during the pandemic as well, and this involves China as well. What I see here is a reflection which is not necessarily introduced by the pandemic, but that was strengthened by the pandemic. We see here a trend of reconceptualization of growth models. However, in the South, what I do observe is this is something that we observe a lot less in the South. I mean, what I see is more of the same. And I apologize, I'm alluding more to Latin America. I'm not sufficiently aware of the situation in Africa or the Middle East. I do know, I can say that there are certain regions in Africa that have different circumstances. So I definitely won't delve into these regions because I can't say that I master them enough. And I'd like to conclude with this. I mean, a region that was heavily struck by the pandemic, and Brazil, in fact, has suffered more than 600,000 deaths due to COVID. And Brazil was one of the countries that has had the most number of deaths due to the pandemic, and I see very little discussions that take into account the effects of the pandemic, and that also address a reconceptualization of development, what we can do to take into account these green transitions and other factors. And I will leave it at that. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I mean, it's your insight is very interesting, and the growth models and the inflections and the different approaches on the growth, the issues with the growth models that had underlying factors that preceded the pandemic, and that the pandemic had accelerated this reflection, and also the necessity to perceive the future differently rather than the past organizational model. And this reflection on the model is not only a reflection on the growth model, but rather on a social model and a development model. The Green Deal naturally is both a reflection on issues pertaining to the energy transition and the digital transition, but it also addresses citizens and how to instigate the behavioral change amongst the citizens to mitigate these risks. But this approach is not necessarily shared by all regions in the world. it is maybe more so the United States or China, with what you said about the shared prosperity. What we see in the countries of the South are some initiatives that are emerging here and there, but this reflection, it does remain at its embryonic stages in the countries of the South. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Sarbim, and if he could also shed some light on how these uncertainties today and that remain, and this is something that we have seen in these with the onset of these new variants, even in the past few days. I mean, how can this disrupt long-term visions? I mean, not only the exiting the short term, but also the long-term vision, and how can this lead to a reflection on what I was saying earlier in the introduction, is the link between the pandemic and globalization, as far as the global dynamics of the economy goes. I mean, there are also some interesting ideas that are worth delving into. I mean, we are all ears to hear your perspective of this issue, of this perspective on growth models and how the future looks and how the future looks with all this. So thank you, Mr. Arabi, and thank you to the Policy Center for having invited me to take part in this discussion. It's always a great pleasure for me to be here with you and to share the floor with my fellow panelists. I believe that the COVID pandemic, I mean, for me, is a major turning point, which is compared in a way that we can compare to the impact of the Second World War. Given the extent, it's a geographical extent, I mean, sparing no country in the world, given its economic and social impact, and due to the fact that this pandemic has created major challenges at a time where the world itself was questioning globalization and who would be emerging as the most important power on the planet. And consequently, this is a global crisis that would require a global response. And what we see is that it is extremely challenging to arrive today to have a global and coordinated solution or approach. And I will say a few more words on that later on. And I agree with Pedro when he says that the pandemic has, in fact, unveiled some issues or underlying issues that existed before, whether it is the benefits or even the dangers of globalization, or even the growing inequalities that have been further strengthened by the consequences of the pandemic, and also to a certain extent, just for the pandemic, if we were to link it with globalization, well, it has both revealed the strengths and weaknesses of globalization. Because if we would take a look at what is happening today, well, we had a global economy which was very integrated, very organized, and in such a way, in a way that, and in the end, which was quite fragile, because the weakness of the value chains, or where the most weakest are suffering incredible consequences. For example, if you were the United States, I mean, we can see the cost of the containers that have risen from $5,000 to $25,000 US, and with major repercussions on inflation, on supply security. And it was incredible to see that at the beginning of the pandemic, the rich countries in Europe did not have the production capabilities, for example, for the manufacturing masks or for different, I mean, for PPEs. So this has led people to reflect on the dependence and the benefits that are created by globalization, and that also require a certain questioning of the current development models, where instead of offshoring, we started talking about onshoring, where we try to have a better control of value chains by trying to make sure they are as close to home as possible. And this is I mean, I really can't say that we are in post-COVID by any means. We are still in the very heart of the COVID crisis. And if you see, for example, the group that I work with, Santinia, they have made forecasts to try to see what could happen, or what could happen with the global economy. And so we see three scenarios. The first is that the convergence between certain countries in the the south and the rich countries, which was a phenomenon which was related to globalization. While this convergence is diverging or stopping and even diverging, and consequently there will be a sort of bigger catch up between there will be a lot more to catch up between the rich and less rich countries. And the second point is that the reaction of the authorities has been very different based on their capabilities. I mean, in the rich countries, what we noted was things that were inconceivable before the pandemic. For as far as the strengthening of social safety nets went, and extraordinary expenditures, which reduced their leeway, which will necessarily reduce their leeway. We will be able to get back to more interesting things where you have certain countries of the South, particularly Africa and countries in Latin America, that will need resources and foreign investments that won't necessarily arrive due to what had to be done by these rich countries to get out of the woods themselves. And the second point is that the international institutions have reacted to the pandemic, and the poor countries in Africa and whatnot, and this could create significant debt issues, which will further exacerbate the pre-existing debt issues. And as such, the possibility for these countries to access more generous debt conditions or will be dealing with quite a few challenges given what they've had to do to deal with the crisis. And the third point is the fact that we will have economies that will be advancing at different paces, with the rich countries or OECD countries, that the United States, China, that will regain their pre-COVID situation probably much faster, probably at the end of the year.
Take Africa, Latin America, and other Southeast Asian countries. If you look at all these countries, the recovery or return back to the pre-COVID period would not happen before the end of 2022 or even the end of 2023. In any case, we're going to be having a lack or shortage that is absolutely significant and remarkable. Sandenia has noticed that the difference between the loss of wealth between 2019 to 2022 will account for approximately 15% of the world GDP, which is absolutely paramount. Therefore, all these reconstitutions on all these scenarios are worrying, and I feel concerned of the fact that if the world has not reacted in a coordinated manner to such a direct and obvious threat as the pandemic that has cost lives, I have no clue how we're going to get organized to face something that is even more serious and dangerous, the pandemic, and that is the climate change. We've seen this in COP26. What we manage to say at the end, even if we actually use the most positive spin in the language, is not likely to respond to the seriousness of the situation. Of course, we're talking, like Pedro said, of the Green Deal in the United States, etc. But the question is whether the size of this response is not at the level of the challenge that we need to face. And in addition to this, as we'll have to recover from an economy that highly depends on fossil energies, there will be an increased demand of all these fossil energies. And we are now witnessing this with the difficulty to stop the energy production by using coal energy, etc. So in other words, we had a globalization process that was very controversial and that was shook up by the pandemic, seriously. And the models that are appearing and rising are models that require a greater international cooperation and a better functioning of the multilateral system at a point where the time where the system is blocked by conflicts between the United States and China for the world leadership. So all this leads me make me sound way too pessimistic, but I leave it up to my colleagues to say that I'm wrong and contradict me. So thank you for your attention. So we are a skeptical Latin America, with a vision of the world that is pessimistic. So maybe Africa will sound more positive, even if Africa is in a very serious situation and not a viable situation, will present another perspective of the crisis. Anyhow, you have really pictured the reality of globalization. You have expressed the fears and highlighted the fears that are fully satisfied of the divergence that might occur while exiting this crisis and in the world economy prospect. And you have also highlighted the issue of the financing and debt that not only low-income countries are faced with, but also intermediary income countries. And you have also insisted on the fact that international cooperation is also in its ups and downs, and maybe is not at the level of the responsibility that is imposed by the pandemic. And this is another issue that we will be addressing in the third phase in a deeper way. So, but your questioning, your analysis rather, is a good transition to that second question that we are asking you and kindly putting out your appreciation. And that is, if the future is not clear yet, and especially in this uncertainty and period at national and world level, and if the future is not visible yet, but we do know what we shouldn't do or must not do, and we need to figure out what are the major problems to solve. And the question is how to move towards more sustainable and fairer societies, or towards a fairer world. So you referred to the issue of sustainability. You also reminded us of the COP26 and the recommendations and conclusions that came out of this global gathering that were quite discouraging. The issue of going back to fossil energies. So this climate kind of crisis is also has a greater incidence and implication on the COVID crisis. So this whole ecological environmental dimension of the crisis and the pandemic is also a very major source of concern for us. So at two levels. So how can we bring collective answers and responses to global warming to avoid that the level of transmission or the scale of transmission of the epidemics is aggravated by the climate change, and climate crisis? And also, how can we protect biodiversity? This is absolutely paramount. Protecting our natural resources in most of our countries, in southern countries particularly, how to protect our biodiversity. This is such a great asset for all of us, and it's also a great potential. And beyond this ecological or environmental dimension of the pandemic, the latest decisions, and I echo you, and I really agree with you, the latest decisions are not really in favor of a happy ending and exiting from this pandemic. And on the other hand, when you look at the inequalities that have been aggravated by the pandemic, and the inequalities might end up being aggravated by the pandemic. So also the development models that we need to figure out with this important dimension, demographic and development will wait a lot on public policies, namely in the African regions. And how can we make sure that that at the time where we exit the crisis, we will be able to mitigate inequalities? Is it possible to design this exit and to think ahead how we can exit and recover and to fill in the gaps of inequalities between men and women, generations, and also social inequalities, environmental inequalities to eradicate poverty? So linkages between ecological, environmental inequalities, and exiting the crisis on the pandemic. So Mrs. Candide, can you please tell us more, elaborate more about this? As you are really an activist in the women empowerment, as you referred to earlier on, inequalities between men and women are the most important inequalities today. What is your vision on this? Thank you very much. As I said earlier on, if I were to go back to Pedro's comments earlier on, who was saying that the situation did prevail prior to the pandemic. Yes, it did, but today it's accelerated, and the pandemic has caused us to identify the weaknesses and the strength. But now what matters is, now that we have been able to assess the drawbacks and consequences of this pandemic, to be able, on the basis of this assessment, change the momentum. And this results in a whole shift of the economic model. We have to rethink those economic models. And when we look at the inequalities between men and women, there is a gap. Of course, there has been some changes and progress over the last 10 years, but the gap has widened and has gotten worse. So we need to focus, especially governments and international organizations need to rethink the model in order to focus on those priority sectors and fields that will allow us to achieve a certain balance between men and women and strike that balance between men and women. So in other words, our daily life that is shaken today and is really challenged today because of climate change, etc. Like take women in Africa, for instance, in the rural areas who are fetching water and fetching also wood for heating. With the climate change today, they don't even have the possibility to do those daily tasks. And also, look at the husbands. The husbands used to stay at home, but now they have to actually move to other places and walk and go to seek a job in another places. And this challenges the whole family nucleus because of climate change. So how can I put it? These families are already low-income families and vulnerable families their vulnerability is even aggravated. And this really challenges our beliefs with regards to the diseases and on the basis of our values in which our societies were based: equalities, brotherhood, solidarity. So all this is challenged. There is a real turmoil. There is a crisis of trust and confidence that we are witnessing. And this can be felt very strongly. If I take the private sector where I work, this problem is strongly felt, even in our private sector in businesses, because people to get together to trade, it's really challenging. It's really challenging because no one trusts the others. There's a real confidence crisis. And because of the pandemic, it really bridges that divide, and the social distancing and the distancing of families and being far from things and being no longer close to things. This really widens that gap. And therefore, there is necessarily major social and organizational shifts and changes that will compel us to rethink on a more sustainable basis the whole societal organization, taking on board and taking into account the climate change, environmental problems, and how can we protect the biodiversity in order for us to take the most of it and take the most benefits of it. So this is, to my mind, the major challenges for women. Of course, the show goes on for women since the mid 2000 up to now. We've been talking about gender equality and equalities between men and women, but this is endless. There are so many things to take care of and to address. And with COVID, this is going to be more complicated. If our governors and if our rulers do not rethink their policies of urban population, urban development population, and development model, this will be further aggravated. It will be another problem. Therefore, new programs need to be shaped and designed and also allocate the necessary resources to implement them successfully. Thank you very much for those clarifications. This is an ongoing debate, an ongoing fight and struggle. You're absolutely right. On the issue of inequalities, if I may, I'd like to address Pedro, as I have a burning question to ask him, taking into account our realities in Africa, even in Morocco and other neighboring countries where the pandemic has resulted in an increase of poverty levels. We all know everywhere around the world, this has been the fact, regardless and irrespective of social and financial resources that have been mobilized by the public powers to mitigate the social impact of the pandemic. Poverty yet has increased dramatically. Is it the case in Latin America or in Brazil in particular? And in addition to this poverty increase that also resulted in an equality and a greater inequality, I'd like to know whether territorial inequalities have gone worse. In a country like Brazil, it is a very big country, and also in Morocco, but maybe not in the same level. I'd like to know whether territorial inequalities gone worse, because some territories or some regions have been more challenged than others by the crisis. Did you experience the same reality in Latin America and more particularly in Brazil? And what are the form of responses to this increased inequalities? Well, the answer may be yes. There was an article in the economic newspaper of Brazil publishing new data saying that Brazil has accounted for 5 million of new poor. So people who were at the limit of the poverty threshold and now are under the level of the poverty threshold. So the answer is positively yes. Well, Brazil has made a great effort in what we call the emerging aids, and Brazil has allocated over 3% of its GDP for social prevention schemes and aid schemes. And more, Brazil has a program that's been implemented for over 20 years, the Bolsa Familia. It's like a family donation or a fee that is targeting the poorest families. And in addition to this program, what Brazil did is allocate emerging aid and financial resources. But this did not prevent the increase in the poverty level, unfortunately. Well, please, I mean, don't misunderstand my words. When I said that the pandemic did not aggravate the poverty levels. Actually, the pandemic, what it did is aggravate some phenomena that were already in the pipeline and in process. And there is a fact that deserves special attention, and that is the main realities is poverty and inequality, indeed. I believe in a certain way that it has become crystal clear that social policies cannot be addressed as something totally separate from economic policies. Maybe the economics performance very much and heavily relies and depends on the social policies. They are fully intertwined. And Brazil, and if the GDP of Brazil has not dropped in a spectacular manner last year, it is certainly because of the economic effects of the social help and aids that were granted by the government that has allowed the demand to be kept at a level, preventing a drastic drop. So beyond the extreme situations like the one that we're still experiencing and witnessing today of a pandemic, what really, well, there are some new ideas and thoughts that are gaining momentum and reminding us of the importance of the social dimension. I'm not saying that Brazil was not paying attention to social protection, because the Bolsa Familia is a very good evidence of it. But we need to maybe go back to the social programs and prevention programs and figure out how they really are important to achieve social cohesion. Lastly, to echo what Mrs. Lagarde said, the lack of trust and confidence between citizens, what we call the lack of social capital. That is a very clear characteristic of southern societies. So when you compare southern societies to northern societies, I think the most developed societies in the north, where the social capital is very developed, is very good. The level of trust and confidence between citizens is greater. This is a very important element indeed. I may be deviating from your question, but maybe this is something that we should ponder on. Even in the most developed and advanced countries, we can sense, I can see, and the pandemic has showed this very clearly. We have seen a very worrying phenomena that has to do with the lack of social cohesion, and that is the reaction to vaccination, for instance, that is in the name of individual freedom. That is, of course, a very important part. Well, you have like a very important part of the population rejecting something that is for the common good and advocated as something for the common good. I don't know, because this pandemic is compared to the Second World War crisis, but the countries that have witnessed the World War II and that have gone through bombing, they have shown a level of economic and social, a greater social and economic cohesion. greater than our countries in the South. And I'm really struck to see in those societies where all the information is available and where societies and people are educated with public money in public universities that had this strong reaction to something that is made obviously in the name of the common good and common interests. So this dismantling of the common interests in the layers of our societies that explains in a way the length and duration of this pandemic in these societies, southern countries. We've seen the pandemic returning to Europe and coming back to Europe, and even prior to this variant, because the fifth wave of COVID has started way before. So I'm really surprised to see this. And this is indeed a phenomenon, a societal phenomena that is really worrying and is really challenging the very idea of choice of society rather than a development model. So a society that is seeing itself as such. So Marcel Gaussier, a philosopher, French philosopher, has asked a very interesting question. What really keeps us together in a society and unites us in a society? So after decades of individualism, overwhelming individualism in our Western societies, we need to ask this question and to see where are the limits of this individuality. And this is common good and common interest. And it's really important to revive that feeling. I hope I've answered your question, but indeed, in this whole constellation of facts and trends that was brought about with the pandemic, and this is where the shoe pinches, the very burning and overwhelming fact for the future of our societies, because this can really underpin the capacity of societies to really define a common future and common good. Thank you very much. I think you really pinpointed a very important aspect that Jean-Louis will elaborate on, I'm sure, is the issue of public policies to address poverties or inequalities, so irrespective of the public expenditures and redistribution policies. So this pandemic shock has revealed something very important. So maybe the public policies have mitigated part of this shocks, but it has been exacerbated by the resurgence or the rebirth of the social cohesion. And that is the case of countries like Morocco, for instance, that can be seen through the increased remittances from abroad, from Moroccans residing abroad. So we thought at a certain point that the crisis will slow down the remittances, but we have witnessed a very important increase of remittances of migrants and Moroccan residing abroad to their families. Also, urban population transmitting money and transferring financial resources to the rural areas and rural relatives. So this has been a trend, a greater solidarity, showing solidarity. Also, traditional solidarity has been shown, peasant solidarity. And the question is that these forms of responses, whatever they are, cannot be sustainable. So as you said, we have to rethink the social policies, the redistribution policies, access to social services and welfare without really having total assistance, but coming back to a welfare state. So if the development model raises our interest on agriculture, for instance, on green agriculture, decarbonization of the industry, they should also question us on how to rethink social policies to give us greater sustainability and sustainable solidarity. Jean-Louis, my apologies if I'm going to shift to the next question, because this is a burning question for us as Southern countries, this question is something that you have pondered on very deeply. I think what Candide and Pedro said on the social disintegration or discohesion is really fundamental. Studies have been conducted on the impact of Bolsa Familia or the oportunidades in Mexico that show clearly that these kind of social policies have managed to mitigate the impact on income poverty, if I may say so. But what it's much more difficult to do, and this will be one of the sustainable consequences of the pandemic, is that with 80% of children in the world that have, well, 80% of the children in the world at a certain point have not attended school. So coming up with social policies that try to repair this or to fix this poverty of learning and knowledge and cognitive and social poverty, this is much more difficult to implement. And this requires the kind of solidarity that Pedro and Candide were talking about. And I believe that one of the most dangerous aspects of the pandemic is, to my mind, the fact that we have not managed to reach a common understanding of the problem. And this is extremely, extremely dangerous and serious, at least here in the United States. In order to come up with the social policies, they need to have a common understanding of the problem that we're trying to overcome and to face, and to see how science has been politicized and has become a political tool. It really is scary. Because if on fundamental questions like vaccination or the social dimension of the vaccine have become politicized, and even when the consequences of this political process have shown, take the United States, you can make a correlation between the political or the political color of a state and the seriousness of the pandemic. And this is incredible. And when you think closer and look closer, I think this is all linked to those who are disappointed from the globalization, who are at the core of the return of populism in the United States and in many European countries. The losers of globalization have elected leaders who, in a certain way, have aggravated the debate on, for instance, the management of the pandemic in the United States in 2019 and 2020. It has been purely and simply political. And the consequences are really serious because they actually question the fact. Well, we were talking about individuality. The individualism is applying to science. I have the right to my science. I have the right to my knowledge. And all this with the exacerbating effect of social media. And this has resulted in a climate where the definition of common interest is more and more and increasingly difficult. And without any definition of common interest, how in the world are we going to be able to set up public policies that will try to mitigate the inequalities in income? Because inequalities in knowledge, in access to school, in schooling are much more complicated than the very fact to be able to transfer money to people to meet their basic needs and make ends meet. So this issue of lack or failure of the social consensus that is at the very core of any social cohesion that has been strengthened by a political response or scientific response to a health phenomena is, for me, one of the most serious and sustainable consequences of this pandemic. It will take a lot of time to try and rebuild this social consensus that requires policies hard to implement with the situation that we're witnessing right now in the United States. Currently, you have an extraordinary divergence between the popularity of some social policies that are proposed by the current administration and the political blockage of these proposals in the decision-making bodies of the Congress in particular. So to re-engineer or to reboot the social consensus. So we need to start from scratch and start a social consensus that does not exist. So we are in a blockage situation. That is, to me, very, very serious because it's based largely on a refusal of the fact, a denial of facts, a denial of science, a denial of reality. And this is a phenomena that is not brand new to my mind. We've been through this in the 19th century here in the United States history, but it's still something very hard to address, and that we need to think more seriously. I don't know if my colleagues here and my co-panelists think the same, but I'm very concerned by this lack of a common understanding of the challenges that we are facing and that are the prerequisites to be able to come up with policies that will help us overcome these challenges. Thank you.
I fully agree with you because this issue that's being addressed at both at the national level and the global level, and it is connected as what Madame was saying earlier on the issue of trust. How can we reestablish trust, individual trust, and institutional trust, which is the most important in this logic of preserving or broadening the common good and to have a consensus around what this definition of common good is and how to achieve it or materialize it. So this issue of trust takes us back to how the responses to, or how societies may respond. I mean, is it through a political consensus or is it through a social compact or that maybe goes beyond the scope of a consensus, which would involve socioeconomic actors, and how this compact, I mean, it shouldn't only be have a declarative approach, or it should be based on it should have a certain number of guidelines or objectives, and we need to see how the society can be mobilized around these objectives. And so this is a very delicate issue indeed. We are already now, I mean, pre-crisis, we were all living in societies where individualism prevails over the collective, and so we all live in societies both in the north and the south at different paces and at different levels, where social mediation is losing its quality. I mean, social mediation in the broad sense of the term, whether it is in terms of so civil society and how it plays out. I mean, how public policies can convey this disgruntledness, and how they can address this disgruntledness. And this is indeed an issue which I believe both at the national level and which requires a modernization of the dialogue, social dialogue instruments, to step out of the box with the sharing of income, to have a much more of a societal take on things, without necessarily heading towards an approach of a sort of more flexible consensus. It's important to compromise rather than have a sort of laxist consensus. I mean, it's important to have a moral engagement, or to, I mean, this is maybe one of the aspects that should be taking place at the national level. And also, it's important to review national governance. I mean, both with respect to common goods, and how this governance can also address the right for nations to overhaul the right for this, the perspective of overhauling international institutions and the decision-making processes, and how we could reboost the institutions that bear multilateralism, both from an economic or social or trade perspectives, and also just with respect to the reflection of the future of the world, I mean, for the UN, and also in the from the financial standpoint as well. So this notion of rethinking global governance, I think today is absolutely topical and paramount. This being said, this issue of this collective or global response, and this need for dialogue, and even at the national level, it's important for nations to react, especially in the countries of the South. And one of the issues that is raised in the countries of the South, and maybe even the countries of in the North to a certain extent, is what arbitrations need to be made, or the choices for sectoral development or social policies, because there are some choices to be made, or financial choices that need to be made. But this is definitely something that will remain. I mean, some also talk about building the future based on the life economy, by focusing on the priorities for health priorities or education, for example, by also including in this life economy a lifestyle, a sort of agricultural production. I mean, so it's really all about how to prepare for the future by sectoral policies that tackle today's challenges. You have the floor, Madam Abbas, to give us your standpoint on the life economy and these arbitrations, and how they can be addressed maybe at the national level before we head on to global governance. Thank you very much. I think here that we are pinpointing the fundamentals of life itself. So as we were saying, it's important to rethink the social system, even social cohesion, and what should also be done is to rely on a certain re-established legitimacy of, or rather illegitimacy of decisions. And to do so, as you mentioned, these need to be decisions that have a social impact. And if I were to take the example of vaccination, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were so many discordances in the perspective of variations or discrepancies between the positions of countries, of the pharmaceutical industry, etc., which completely impaired the legitimacy of the vaccination campaign, and which continues to prevail among populations. In order for the populations to regain this trust and to accept and embrace vaccination, it's important to engage in a social dialogue. It's important to have the social negotiations. People need to sit around the table and to have collegial conversations. And so what we see today is that often these are decisions that sort of just are plopped upon the population, and that are deprived of their individual freedom. So this is a situation where it's important to think about the collective well-being. But obviously, there are also fundamental freedoms and individual freedoms that should not be neglected. And so this is why it's extremely challenging, and we need to sit around the table and to rethink things and to see what's feasible for us, what's feasible for our countries. And this obviously varies from one country to the next. I mean, all of the countries have not experienced COVID in the same way. So each country needs to rethink things based on the impact that COVID has had on their environment in order to find reach a consensus and to find feasible and sustainable solutions. I mean, as far as education goes, especially in Africa, I mean, everything is we're heading towards a digital world, and so unlike other countries, we have broadband issues. I mean, if there isn't a good internet connection, how can you switch to online education? And so this is what the future is looking at like today. And so when we want to have the in-person education training, well, the pandemic is back, comes back in the way. And so if, for example, we have people people that are COVID positive, and we saw, for example, I mean, we end up having to close down classrooms because, for example, we have students that are COVID positive, and so there's education that needs the education model that needs to be completely reviewed to modernize. I mean, to modernize the whole system, to make it more topical, to make sure that it is adapted to the circumstances that we are living through today. And things had started before COVID, but now the situation is all the more pressing. And now here we are today with the Atlantic dialogues taking place online, where just a few years ago we were used to meeting all together in Marrakesh. And so this is a direct consequence of COVID, and these consequences will continue to exacerbate. And this is why I was saying that the virus is here to stay, and we need to learn how to cope with it. We need to find new models, new solutions. And Mr. Larrabee has in fact said it. We need to have a collective intelligence that leads us to act collectively without as much for things to happen vertically, but we need to ensure that that everyone can share their standpoint, share their perspective, and it is only in this way that we can move forward. Now, as far as the IT goes, there's also cybersecurity. We're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about cybercrime. I mean, if everything we need to switch online, we need to switch to an online, and for example, with e-banking and e-commerce and whatnot, well, we need to make sure that this system is secured, which is becoming more and more, which is a lot more worrying with what's taking place in the world today. And obviously, we did know the solidarity at the global level and the vaccines that are being sent to developing countries. That's true, but developing countries themselves need to also have their own pharmaceutical industries. We did notice these gaps, and this is what the pandemic has revealed: the absence of actual pharmaceutical industries in our countries, and we needed to wait for the industrialized countries to develop the vaccines and to send it to us before we could before we could provide care to patients. There was also the mask manufacturing and whatnot. I mean, it's true that despite the fact that Europe also suffered from this as well, but indeed there still is a lot of progress. There still is a lot of room for improvement, but we need to find a system that will be able to that will allow us to tackle this pandemic. I mean, it is an invisible enemy, but we need to, we need to stay relentless, and we need to continue to fight, and we need to overcome it because we are humans. I mean, and this is definitely something that we need to continue focusing on. Thank you very much. You have definitely shed some light on the challenges and priorities that we need to focus on, and for the future, and to build the future of tomorrow. Education and health and vaccination for all, that would also extend to the pharmaceutical industries, and that the health risks as well. And there's also the issue of there's also digital technology that has its fair share of risks and opportunities. Pedro, I believe that based on these I think that these points of view probably draw I'm sure there is a consensus based on what's been shared, but now the idea is how we can create synergies to ensure that there are consistent and coordinated public policies, both at the national and global levels. Well, it's true that there are quite a few things that have been said. It's must say it's challenging to maybe summarize it all now by trying to answer your question on how to step out of the pandemic and how to find this arbitration between the policies, because it's true that we cannot have all. I mean, there are some choices to be made. I mean, as much, even if we want to have all hands on deck, we can't tackle everything at the same time. Now, what you also mentioned consensus, which is indeed important. And just to make a positive comment, I mean, for example, Brazil, which is a vast country with 200 million and a population of 200 million, we have built. And this wasn't through a convention or through a. I mean, this what we built things, or what I mean, we built. I mean, we're able to construct some major consensus. I mean, against inflation, notably. I mean, inflation is very damaging, especially. I mean, this is the period where there has been an episode of hyperinflation in the 1990s that Brazil suffered from, and even if more than one generation has gone by since when we've been able to get rid of inflation in 1994, well, in society, the idea of inflation and the idea of inflation, I mean, politicians know that inflation is not something that would be well received, and they would be that would be very poorly received by the population. So politicians that would have responsible social policies and that would lead to inflation, well, there would be a heavy cost to pay during the elections, and that's the case of the government today. And so this is why there was a consensus, or rather a high cost, because we had to go through that hyperinflation. There's also a consensus regarding poverty and inequality, which does not mean that there is a consensus that will maybe extend to all social policies. Because we have several social policies, or rather different ways to engage in social policies. But the idea that it's important to prioritize poverty and inequality, well, I think that this is something that something for which there definitely is a consensus. And so, for the sake of this consensus, well, there quite a few mistakes were made, but it's still important, nonetheless, to have this consensus and to say that this is something that cannot be absent from the public policy agenda. So there, I mean, having this consensus is advisable. I mean, having other consensus, I mean, consensus on other topics would also be very much advisable.
Pardon. Vous aviez...
Oh, I apologize that you had finished. Should I continue? I thought that you had finished speaking. So I also have another important point to share on this arbitration between the policies. So, Mr. Larrabee, I think that much less an issue of sectors rather than the design of consensus, finding policies or finding consensus between the policies, as I mentioned, or trying to be very much realistic. There was something that was said by Mr. Sagi, which seems, which was very interesting to me. I mean, this convergence between the North and the South no longer exists. What we saw in the early 2000s, is no longer exist. I mean, we are in a different world today. We are in a world today where we will see growing divergences. I mean, with the transition towards a green economy, and we are definitely on the path of a divergence and no longer a convergence. For a major for many developing countries, for Latin America, for example, and this includes Brazil and Mexico. So this is something that we need to bear in mind and to think on the strategic priorities that need to be set. And also maybe think about with the instruments that we have in international trade, and also develop new skills in international trade. I mean, for example, for the case of Brazil, and to create competitiveness clusters. Thank you very much, Pedro. I'm sorry, but I have to speed up the end of the meeting because I'm told that we have 5 minutes left, and that I need to give the floor to Jean-Louis, and maybe to make a link between these priorities and global governance and this asymmetrical exit from the pandemic that we are witnessing in the world today. And if there's any final comments that you'd like to share before concluding in 1 or 2 minutes. All right, I will try to be brief. I think that the challenge here is to reach a social consensus and also to translate this into a social contract. I mean, this social contract is made up of policies, and I fully agree with Pedro on the importance of the consistency of these policies. And I would also place at the heart of these policies the redefinition of an education in of the 21st century. And so this is absolutely fundamental. Many of the world's children are very poorly educated, and for me this is a major challenge because we have very few children that become an elite and that leave behind them many children that unfortunately end up being left behind, or that are suffering from poor education. And the second point, and the pandemic has revealed this, we cannot have policies that are purely national, because in fact the economic space the economic space is wider or broader than the political space. And so what the political leaders decide is limited to a certain geographical area whereby the economy plays out. The economy plays out worldwide, and so this also applies to if this applies to the pandemic. Well, I think this will apply even more so for climate change. I think it's impossible to have a real reaction or response to climate change that is not global, which leads me to the issue of global governance. And the issue that we are faced with today is that global governance is based on a power dynamics which existed at the end of the Second World War and which has deeply has, made, that has greatly changed, but unfortunately this has not led to a change in this type of system. And what I'm fearing is having two competitive systems, and we saw the example of the multilateral development banks that I'm very familiar with, and the refusal of the World Bank and the IMF to open their arms to China has led to the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, which is much bigger than the World Bank will ever be. So in a way, this global governance requires something that's very challenging. It's a transition. I mean, maybe not consensual, but a transition that's a partner. It's a transition where there from a system where there was one global power to one where there's two global powers, and one that is surpassing the other. And in all the changes or shifts in global leadership that I am familiar with, well, this has never happened without a major upheaval or even a war. And so this is why it's really important to restrike a balance and to have a global dynamics, the dynamic that is much more balanced. And this is, in fact, fundamental for the future of our planet. And I would have thought that the consensus on the risk posed by climate change would have encouraged a broader cooperation, but I think that is very difficult to see how this will all play out. I mean, we do need somebody that's forward-looking, such as Keynes, and unfortunately, I don't see anybody on the global playing field that can set the tone and play this leadership role that is so necessary. So this is an excellent conclusion that you have just shared, and that I'm sure we all agree with.
It's both skepticism and also a belief, a very deep belief that we need to act. Maybe like a voodoo. Let's say it that way. But then we need to act and walk the talk with the state, with the conflicts and tensions that we have at hand. So, and we need to figure out how to regulate them. You have pinpointed something that is absolutely fundamental, and that is education. It is the bottleneck and very hard of this capacity to gain ownership over its future, over its freedom. So, but beyond the education priority sector, how can we actually build that a mindset of common sense, a common interest and common good, So we need to actually have a vector that will mobilize us. And this is the only channel that we could use to pave the way towards a more peaceful world, where rather than competition that result in very harsh competitions. International institutions are the ones who manage water, and even if the logics and rationale of leading powers try to legitimate their choices through some multilateral international institutions, and this is indeed a major challenge we're faced with today, to rethink the world and global governance at different levels, financial, political, commercial, etc. And these are the leading leverages of the building of tomorrow's future for a shared equity and justice and wealth. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. You were extremely interesting. You really thought out of the box, and we kind of pinpointed deeply some of the questions, some. We will have, of course, further opportunities to meet and discuss further these themes. I wish you an excellent end of the day. I was absolutely delighted to see you again and meet for the first time some of you. The Policy Center is always open to these kind of debates, so let's act together for a common good at our humble level, but could be very extremely important to mainstream our ideas. Thank you very much, Mr. Larby. Thank you very much. Bravo.